Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Ozark Mountains. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. They say the ship drifted into the forest one foggy night, and by dawn it was gone, taking its crew and the truth with it. In the summer of 1884, the remote hills of the Ozarks held more secrets than map-makers could chart. A small logging community called Pine Hollow, perched along a sluggish tributary of the Current River, first reported something utterly strange: a boat drifting silently in a shallow meadow miles from any waterway. The locals called it the Dry Ship, a vessel that appeared to sail without water. The report reached the county seat via a terse dispatch. Vessel observed 15 rods inland by Mr. Carter's cabin. No creek or stream present. No persons aboard. When a small inspection party arrived, led by Sheriff Amos Bledsoe, they found a wooden hull of modest size, its hull intact but hollow. The grass around it bent strangely, as though the boat had pressed onto the sod not days but weeks ago. No footprints, no tracks, not a single disturbance beyond the ship's own outline. In archived correspondence from 1885, a visiting naturalist, Dr. Henry Whitlock, referred to the finding in passing. It lies among the Ozark ridges, stranded as though swallowed by land. The region reminds me of meadows near Meadow Spring, land shaped by invisible currents. Meadow Spring, a known karst spring in the Ozark Plateau, is notable for hidden subterranean waterways and abrupt underground flow. Its presence in Whitlock's memory, though distant, served as a subtle reminder. Water in the Ozarks often hides beneath the surface. Neighbors in Pine Hollow spoke in hushed tones. Some said the ship had glided inland during a night mist. Others insisted its appearance was tied to an old logging road that once traced a creek now vanished. Mr. Carter, whose property lay nearest the site, claimed he heard what sounded like distant paddling one night, though no canoe or craft was in any water nearby. The initial findings set in motion a curious chain of events: letters, dispatches, local gossip, and began a file that would grow stranger with every addendum. By the following spring, 1885, the Dry Ship of Pine Hollow had become something of a rural legend. Farmers traveling to Van Buren would stop at the Carter property to see it, some out of fascination, others from dread. The vessel, about 20 feet long, sat lodged in clay and grass. Its bow pointed north as if frozen mid-journey. It bore no registration, no markings, and no sign of prior use. A carpenter named Elijah Boone, who examined the hull, claimed the wood was not of these parts, denser and darker than native oak or pine. He estimated its construction date to be no more than 5 years old. Yet the keel showed a patina closer to 20. When pressed, Boone said quietly, "It ain't right for something so new to look so old." The county clerk's record for July 1885 lists it as one vessel found grounded, no ownership declared. That same month, a brief article appeared in the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. A curious artifact has been discovered in the Ozark Mountains. A ship of uncertain origin, found far from any navigable river. Locals say it arrived after a storm with no thunder. The storm in question, documented in weather ledgers from June 17, 1884, had indeed struck southern Missouri with torrential rain and flash flooding, but Pine Hollow lay untouched. No waterline, no erosion, and no driftwood suggested that the vessel had floated there naturally. Sheriff Bledsoe, reluctant to indulge superstition, sent for assistance from Dr. Henry Whitlock, whose earlier notes compared the region's terrain to Meadow Spring. When Whitlock arrived that autumn, he took soil samples and traced the meadow's drainage routes, concluding that the ground was riddled with sinkholes and fissures typical of the Ozark karst landscape. His field report speculated, if the ship originated elsewhere, it may have traveled underground for some distance before surfacing. The ideas of a boat sailing beneath the earth captured imaginations far beyond the county. Yet Whitlock's reasoning, however geological, failed to explain how such a vessel could remain intact while traversing solid limestone caverns. Locals began referring to the site as the land harbor. Children dared one another to touch the hull. Adults avoided it after dusk. Cattle refused to graze near it, and one farmer claimed his well water turned metallic after drawing from the ground within a mile of the meadow. When winter came, frost crept beneath the boat, lifting it slightly from the earth as if the soil itself no longer wished to hold it. By spring thaw, it had sunk again, deeper this time, almost to the gunwale. Sheriff Bledsoe ordered it fenced off, calling it an agricultural hazard. But fences did not keep out curiosity, nor did they stop the next disappearance that would etch Pine Hollow's name into state archives forever: the vanishing of the Carter family themselves. In the summer of 1886, less than a year after the strange vessel's discovery, the Carter family, Thomas, his wife Mary, and their 2 young sons, vanished without a trace. Their cabin, situated only 200 yards from the so-called land harbor, was found empty one Sunday morning by a traveling trader. Breakfast dishes were set neatly on the table, the hearth still warm, and the door unlocked. Outside, the family's wagon remained tethered, and both oxen stood unwatered, as if the day had simply paused mid-motion. Sheriff Bledsoe's report describes the scene with professional restraint. No struggle apparent, no valuables taken, doors and windows unbroken, meal unfinished. The only anomaly recorded in his statement was a set of impressions leading from the cabin toward the meadow, shallow grooves as though something heavy had been dragged. They ended abruptly in the tall grass near the hull of the stranded ship, where the earth had sunken further since winter. A week later, a search party led by Reverend Jonas Worth, who kept meticulous parish notes, combed the surrounding woods. In his journal he wrote, "At dusk we heard a hollow echo from beneath the field, as of air moving through a tunnel. It came and went with no wind above." The following day, Bledsoe ordered the area probed for sinkholes. 2 men lowered weighted ropes, but found nothing but packed clay. The case stalled. The sheriff, already facing ridicule for his handling of the boat affair, filed a final note in October. Family presumed fled or lost to terrain collapse. Yet locals refused to believe the Carters had left willingly. Their few belongings, letters, linens, tools, were all accounted for. The church registry listed them present at service only 6 days before they vanished. One neighbor swore she'd seen a lantern moving near the ship's bow that same night. Dr. Whitlock still documenting karst phenomena for his Ozark survey, returned that winter at Bledsoe's request. He found the vessel half buried, the meadow disturbed as though recently flooded, though no rain had fallen for weeks. He recorded a note of unease. "The ground hums faintly near the hull, perhaps underground water flow, though I cannot locate its source. The air feels charged, the way limestone caverns do before collapse." By 1887, Pine Hollow was nearly deserted. 2 other homesteads reported livestock vanishing overnight. No signs of theft, no broken fences. Some claimed to hear what they called paddles on dry earth in the hours before dawn. When spring arrived, the ship was gone. In its place lay a shallow depression filled with fine silt and pale reeds. The sheriff closed his file entirely, writing across its last page, "Vessel no longer extant. Land absorbed all evidence." Years later, The State Geologic Office would dismiss the entire episode as local exaggeration of sinkhole activity. But among those who once lived near Pine Hollow, the question persisted. What current runs beneath dry land, and what does it carry when it rises? By 1888, Pine Hollow was a name fading from maps, its post road unmaintained and its few remaining residents scattered toward Van Buren or Poplar Bluff. Only Reverend Jonas Wirth stayed behind, claiming a duty to watch the ground until it gives back what it took. His diary, discovered decades later in a church attic, became one of the few surviving records of that year, though much of it was written in a tone of wary faith rather than certainty. In an entry dated April 12, 1888, Wirth wrote, "The meadow has flattened again, though the soil feels hollow beneath one's step. Some nights I hear a low knocking, as of something striking timber far underground." That summer, surveyors from the Missouri Bureau of Mines and Geology passed through, charting the karst formations of the Ozark Plateau, including the vast underground networks near Meramec Spring. One of the engineers, Harlan Easton, later mentioned in correspondence that the Pine Hollow terrain was unusual, with echoing cavities and subsurface resonance inconsistent with surface rock composition. Easton's notes were never formally published, but they confirm what locals had long sensed, that water, air, or something stranger moved invisibly beneath the fields. When the surveyors camped near the abandoned Carter cabin, they noticed faint glimmering in the soil after rain. Phosphorescence, perhaps, or decaying organic matter. Easton recorded it clinically. Luminescent runoff observed after brief storm. Odor of resin or tar. No visible source. Within a week, one of the survey assistants, Caleb Timmons, went missing. His companions awoke to find his bedroll empty, his boots gone, and a line of shallow depressions leading toward the meadow. No sign of struggle, no footprints beyond that point. Easton reported it immediately, though his wording suggested doubt. If man could vanish so cleanly, the earth must conspire. Whitlock's earlier theory, that underground rivers occasionally breach the surface, was revisited after this disappearance. The Bureau concluded that unstable strata and air pressure shifts might create optical illusions or sudden subsidence. Yet no sinkholes appeared. The ground held firm, the grass thick, the air untroubled. Reverend Wirth's final entry that autumn captures the quiet dread that remained. "I stood where the ship once lay. The earth is smooth now, but I heard the sound again, slow, deliberate, like oars finding their place. It comes from below." After that, the journal ceases abruptly. He was last seen traveling east toward Ironton, where he intended to present his notes to a regional synod. He never arrived. His horse was later found grazing alone near the current river, reins dragging in the mud. For decades, no one returned to Pine Hollow. The land passed into state hands, left unclaimed and unremarked, until a young geographer rediscovered the forgotten reports in 1912 and found that the terrain no longer matched any known map of the area. By 1912, Pine Hollow existed only in a handful of yellowing records, but its name resurfaced through the work of a quiet and methodical man, Dr. Ernest Colling, a geographer from the University of Missouri. Colling was mapping the hydrological behavior of the Ozark Plateau, focusing on the region between Eminence and Meramec Spring, where subterranean streams often carved entire chambers beneath the forest. In his field notes, Colling mentioned an unrecorded depression several miles southwest of the spring that local guides called the Hollow Basin. When he overlaid his survey maps with 19th-century township records, he found a discrepancy, a missing plot that should have been listed as Pine Hollow Township, yet no official deeds or boundaries remained. Curious, he traveled there that August, accompanied by 2 assistants and a mule-drawn cart of equipment. They camped for 3 nights. On the first evening, Colling described the silence as complete enough to hear one's pulse. By the second night, the team began to notice faint vibrations underfoot, too steady for thunder, too rhythmic for wind. His assistant, Mr. Hawthorne, suggested it might be the underground flow of water. The Ozarks were known for such phenomena. But Colling disagreed, noting that the tremors seemed mechanical, almost intentional. On the third morning, while tracing the contour of the basin, they discovered what appeared to be a wooden beam embedded in the soil. Digging a few inches exposed planking so weathered it crumbled on touch, yet aligned in a curve unmistakably similar to the bow of a ship. The structure lay several feet below the surface, its grain darkened to near black. Colling's written report described the discovery with restraint. Subterranean remains consistent with maritime construction. No sign of riverbed within 10 miles. The formation of the basin suggests slow subsid, hence not flood deposition. The presence of ship-like timber cannot be geologically justified. Fearing damage to the find, they reburied it and marked the site for excavation, though no dig would ever occur. That same night, heavy rain forced the party to retreat north toward Steelville. When they returned a week later, the area had changed. Their markers were gone, replaced by a fresh layer of silt and reeds. The depression had filled with water, a shallow pool no more than a foot deep, reflecting the sky like glass. Colling noted that the water tasted mineral and cold, like the outflow from a cave. His last entry from that trip reads, "The pool moves though no stream feeds it. It rises and falls as if with breath." He later presented his findings to the Missouri Geological Society, which dismissed the report as misinterpretation. But Colling never forgot it. In private correspondence a year later, he wrote to a colleague, "I think the vessel never left. It only sinks and returns, as the land remembers its own tides." By 1914, Dr. Ernest Colling's quiet obsession with the Pine Hollow Basin had turned into a private crusade. Though publicly his papers focused on Ozark hydrology, his personal journals, discovered much later among university archives, read more like a field investigator's diary than a geologist's ledger. He returned to the site twice that year, each time alone. The first visit was in March, when frost still clung to the roots of the sycamores. He noted that the pool he had discovered in 1912 was gone, dried completely, leaving behind a faint spiral pattern etched into the mud. "It resembles the whirl of an oar," he wrote, "too perfect to be random, too soft to have been carved." On his second trip in October, he found the basin transformed again. The spiral had vanished, replaced by shallow indentations, as though something heavy had rested there and pressed the ground into circular grooves. He took measurements, sketches, and a small core of soil, noting the unmistakable scent of resin and decay. When he compared his notes against geological records near Merrimack Spring, the similarities unsettled him. Both sites exhibited rhythmic changes in water level. Breathing pools, the locals called them, where underground streams rose and fell unpredictably, driven by unseen reservoirs deep within the limestone. Colling began to wonder whether the hollow basin was somehow connected to that network, not by river, but by something older, a buried passage once carved by the ancient Osage River before its course shifted centuries earlier. In a letter to the naturalist, Professor Amos Gerber, he wrote, "If one could chart these hidden arteries, I suspect the land itself would appear to pulse. What the sea does for the coast, these rivers do beneath the Ozarks. They carry more than water." By winter, his assistants refused to accompany him again. They said he had grown withdrawn. Speaking of hearing low mechanical sounds at night while camped near the hollow, tones that rose and fell like distant engines, he described them clinically at first, then almost reverently. The rhythm has order. If one stands still, it aligns with the heartbeat. In December of that year, heavy rains swept through the region. A letter from a local rancher reported that the hollow basin had filled once more, but this time with motion. The rancher described ripples forming concentric circles, though no wind disturbed the surface. Beneath the water, something solid gleamed faintly before disappearing again into the silt. Calling arrived 3 days later, but his field notebook ends abruptly after a single line. The hull has returned. When spring thaw came, the basin was empty once again, and Calling was gone. His tent and horse were found intact, his supplies untouched. The only clue left behind was a wet footprint, bare, human-sized, leading into the center of the dry pool, and none returning. The Missouri Geological Society later ruled it an accidental drowning, though there was no water to drown in. When word of Dr. Ernest Calling's disappearance reached Columbia, the University of Missouri treated it as a professional tragedy, not a mystery. His colleagues released a modest obituary in early 1915, praising his dedicated service to the Geological Survey of the Ozark Plateau. No mention was made of Pine Hollow, the basin, or the so-called Vanishing ship. Yet in the years that followed, a quiet pattern of unease emerged among those who handled his papers. One archivist, Miss Ellen Crowther, later recalled in an interview, "His field notebooks had a dampness that never dried. We replaced the binding twice, but the pages always warped by morning." After Calling's disappearance, state geologists attempted one final expedition to the region, partly to locate his remains and partly to verify his claims. The leader of the team, Dr. Byron Haskell, was pragmatic, a man who distrusted folklore. His written objective read, "Determine whether intermittent pools of karst origin could produce the illusion of maritime structures." In late 1916, Haskell and his assistants reached the hollow basin. The area was dry again, overgrown with reeds. Nothing hinted at water or buried timber, until, as they dug near the site's center, their shovels struck hollow wood. The timbers gave slightly under pressure, as if floating in unseen depth. When Haskell ordered a section pried open, cold air escaped from the gap. It carried the scent of stagnant water and pitch. He noted this sensation in his report. "We broke through into a cavity not filled with air nor entirely water, more a vaporous mist, rising like steam yet cold to the touch. The sound beneath resembled a slow knocking, steady as a pulse. Uneasy, the men sealed the breach with clay and covered it with tarpaulin for the night. By dawn, the ground had sunk nearly 2 feet, swallowing the tarp completely. They abandoned the excavation and departed." Haskell's official report to the Missouri Geological Society was cautious, blaming unmapped karst collapse due to subterranean water pressure. Yet, in his private notebook, he added a line that historians would later underline. "Whatever moves there is not water alone." When he returned to Columbia, Haskell developed a tremor that made writing difficult. His colleagues attributed it to exhaustion, but those closest to him said that for years afterward he refused to walk near lakes or streams, insisting that still water listens. Local newspapers mentioned the expedition only briefly, referring to it as the recovery attempt at Lost Pine. No body was found. No trace of Calling's camp beyond his boot prints and a rusted compass, the needle of which had fused in place. By the 1920s, the hollow basin had reverted to wilderness once more. Hunters and trappers gave it a wide berth, calling it the Land Harbor, reviving the same phrase used 40 years earlier when the first ship had been seen. And once again, the rumors returned, of a vessel seen at dusk, appearing where no water ran. By the early 1920s, the legend of the land harbor had drifted out of scientific circles and into campfire folklore. Children in Carter and Dent counties were warned not to wander too far into the woods near the hollow basin, where the ground swallows the careless. A few old settlers remembered the earlier tales of the Carters, the surveyor, and the ship, though details blurred over time. The story became more myth than record, a vessel that appeared whenever the land took a breath. Still, a handful of researchers continued to investigate quietly. Among them was Professor Nora Keating, one of the first women geologists in the state who joined the Missouri Geological Society in 1922. Keating had studied under Dr. Haskell years before and was drawn to the Pine Hollow case after finding his private notes sealed in a cabinet labeled "Field Anomalies, Do Not Publish." In a letter to a colleague, she wrote, "Haskell's phrasing is unlike him. Less analysis, more confession. He writes of knocking beneath the soil as though it were a living pulse." That autumn, Keating led a small survey team to the Hollow Basin, armed with barometers, compasses, and a field phonograph to record ambient vibrations. Her entries describe an oddly tranquil sight: tall grass bending in concentric patterns, no insects audible, and a faint metallic smell rising from the soil after sundown. The team placed the phonograph's horn into a shallow trench overnight, leaving it to record. In the morning, the wax cylinder captured something unmistakable, a slow, rhythmic thud occurring at irregular intervals, each separated by a pause of roughly 11 seconds. The sound was too deep for footsteps, too steady for wind. When played back, Keating noted that the tone resembled the echo of oars against a hollow hull. She wrote, carefully avoiding speculation, "Could subterranean water pressure create this resonance? The rhythm, however, suggests intention rather than accident." The discovery made her uneasy, yet she kept the cylinder, marking it only Hollow Field, October 1922. Years later, when the recording was replayed at low speed, modern analysts found faint secondary tones between the beats, harmonics like human voices submerged in echo. Keating's team spent 2 more nights in the area. On the final evening, a fog rolled in thick and low, covering the basin entirely. Her assistant, James Fuller, wrote afterward, "The fog did not behave like weather. It moved in lines, crossing the field as though following something unseen. At one point, it divided, and I thought I saw the outline of a prow." They left the site the next morning, unnerved but unharmed. Keating never returned. Her subsequent lectures on acoustic geology were praised for innovation, but made no mention of Pine Hollow again. In 1926, her papers were catalogued at the university. Inside one envelope was a brief note: "When the ground remembers water, it floats what it lost." By 1928, the Hollow Basin had become a geographical curiosity, marked on a few state survey maps as unverified depression, no hydrological outlet. The locals still called it the land harbor, though few dared to visit. That same year, the area experienced an unseasonable flood, despite no major rainfall. Nearby homesteads reported the soil weeping water for several days, as if the ground itself had turned porous. When the flood receded, witnesses claimed to have seen wood fragments scattered across the meadow, planks, waterlogged yet dry to the touch. One of those fragments eventually reached the desk of Dr. Silas Marin, curator at the Missouri Historical Society. The timber, roughly 4 inches thick, was sent to St. Louis for examination. Marin's laboratory notes are plain but chilling. Wood grain aligns with marine cypress, not native to this region. Embedded mineral traces consistent with long submersion. No salt residue detected. He cross-referenced his findings with riverboat registries from the 1880s, but no local vessels matched the wood's unique construction. His curiosity deepened when he found references to the dry ship mentioned briefly in an 1885 St. Louis Globe-Democrat article, the same clipping Whitlock had once cited in passing. It was the first tangible link between the original event and the modern reports. Marin sent field assistants to investigate the basin, including a photographer, Samuel Greer, who captured 6 glass plate negatives before a sudden landslip cut the expedition short. Only one photograph survived, a hazy, wide-angle image of a field under low fog. At its center, the silhouette of a structure, curved, ribbed, and unmistakably hull-like, appears half-sunk in mist. Greer insisted it had not been visible to the naked eye when he took the shot. In a letter dated November 1928, Marin summarized the findings for his archive. The hollow basin remains an anomaly where geological and maritime logic collide. Evidence points to a recurring emergence of submerged timber, inexplicably preserved. Whether this is illusion, optical trick, or genuine material manifestation is immaterial. The pattern repeats. He attempted a follow-up expedition the next spring, but torrential weather delayed travel. When he returned in April 1929, the field had changed again. The ground where they'd photographed the silhouette was smooth and dry. The reeds were crushed in a spiral, and the soil emitted a faint sulphurous odor, like a struck match. Locals warned Marin not to camp there. One old man, identified only as Hollis, reportedly told him, "Don't dig under what don't drown. It'll rise when it's ready." That night, Marin recorded a final observation in his field journal. "There are ripples forming in the dust itself. I feel movement through the soles of my boots." The next morning, his tent was found collapsed, his notes scattered but intact. He returned to St. Louis, shaken, refusing to speak of the incident again. The sample plank remained in the Historical Society's collection until it went missing during renovations in 1933. By 1930, the hollow basin was nearly forgotten again, though whispers about the land that breathes persisted among hunters and railway men traveling the Ozark ridges. The old trail near Pine Hollow was now little more than an overgrown depression marked by sycamores and wild plum. Yet that year, the phenomenon returned, quietly, and this time witnessed by men of record. A small crew from the Missouri Pacific Railroad was surveying potential routes for a short freight spur connecting Ellington to Van Buren. On the evening of June 9, 1930, Foreman Luther Price and 2 workers camped near the basin. Their later statements, collected by county authorities, remain the last first-hand account entered into official record. Price described a night of clear skies and still air. Around midnight, the ground began to tremble, not violently, but rhythmically, as though something massive rolled far below. The horses grew restless, and a distant hollow noise rose from the earth, steady and slow, like the creak of ropes or the turning of heavy wood. When one worker, Mason Grant, shone a lantern toward the hollow, the light reflected back, off what appeared to be a curved surface just beneath the soil. They watched as a faint shimmer spread across the basin, the grass flattening in a widening circle. Grant swore he saw the outline of a prow lifting through the dust before everything fell silent again. The next morning, the field was smooth and undisturbed except for one peculiar detail. All their tools, left beside the tent, were damp with cold dew, though the air was dry. Price reported the incident to the county engineer, who noted it in the survey ledger as localized ground resonance. Recommend re-routing. The project was abandoned, and no rail line was ever built near the site. Meanwhile, in St. Louis, Dr. Silas Marin, now older and increasingly withdrawn, gave a single-less tour at the Historical Society titled Hydrological Memory of the Ozark Karst. He referenced Pine Hollow only once, calling it a place where water remembers its shape. Colleagues dismissed the phrase as metaphor, but Marin meant it literally. In his notes, he had connected every recorded incident, from Whitlock's first reference in 1884 to Colling's disappearance in 1914, and drawn a single looping diagram, concentric circles, labeled only currents without river. That same year, a severe drought struck southern Missouri. For months, creeks and springs dried to dust. Yet witnesses traveling near the hollow basin claimed to see fog rising nightly from the bare ground, forming a mist dense enough to glow in moonlight. One report described it moving in the shape of a hull. In October, a regional newspaper, the Springfield Herald, published a brief filler story under the headline, "The Ship Returns to Land." It cited anonymous locals who claimed to have seen a vessel of ghostly timber moving through the weeds. Within days, the paper retracted the piece, citing unreliable sources. But by then, the legend had reignited. For the first time in half a century, the dry ship of Pine Hollow became a story again, told in parlors, mining camps, and roadside diners as a reminder that not all things buried stay that way. By 1932, the drought deepened, cracking the Ozark soil into long fractures that revealed layers unseen for generations. Locals who ventured near the hollow basin claimed they could hear air moving through the ground, soft exhalations, like a cave breathing. What had once been marshy meadow now resembled a drained lake bed, the land sinking inward as though hollow beneath. That spring, a small team of WPA engineers was dispatched to survey the area for potential irrigation works. Among them was George Halper, a young hydrologist who kept a meticulous field diary. His entries, unearthed decades later, document the most detailed description of the phenomenon ever recorded. The basin descends in uneven terraces, each about half a man's height. Soil texture alternates between silt and ash, no visible aquifer, yet the barometer drops when one stands near the center, as if the air is thinner there. Halper and his team established camp beside a sycamore grove and began core sampling. On the third day, they struck timber beneath 12 feet of clay. The core brought up fragments of wood and pitch. The men joked they had found the ghost ship from the old Carter story, a jest Halper did not share. His notes that night grow strangely personal. The wood feels neither dry nor wet. When handled, it hums faintly, like the sound of water in a pipe, but constant. I hear it still when I close my eyes. On May 18th, a mild tremor struck the area. The team recorded a deep resonance, identical to the 11-second pulse, detected by Professor Keating's phonograph 10 years earlier. Halper compared the two records later, noting the rhythm was unchanged, as if the same tide had continued beneath us for decades. That evening, he described a moment of eerie calm before the ground exhaled. His final entry reads, "A draft from below, cool and smelling of tar and salt. There is motion under full. Not collapse, not quake, but rolling, like waves beneath planks. The lantern flickers with no wind." The following morning, only 2 of the 4 engineers remained in camp. Halper and 1 assistant were missing. The survivors reported that the ground near their tent had softened overnight, their instruments sinking several inches into the silt. They assumed Halper and his companion had left before dawn, though their packs and journals remained behind. A later WPA report listed them as lost to ground failure due to karst instability. But a separate internal memo from the State Survey added, in pencil, "Pattern consistent with prior anomalies, possible recurrence of subsurface cavity." The project was canceled immediately afterward. No irrigation works were built. The field station was dismantled, and the hollow basin was once again left to grass, wind, and rumor. In subsequent years, local children whispered that on hot days, when the air shimmered, they could see the shadow of a ship moving just beneath the soil. By the mid-1930s, the vanishing ship of Pine Hollow had settled into that strange borderland between history and myth. The state no longer funded research there. The WPA had moved on, and the last of the Carter County settlers who remembered the first sightings were gone. Yet the story refused to die. Even as roads modernized and towns crept closer, travelers passing through the Ozark backroads sometimes reported a shimmer in the grass, or a patch of ground that seemed to sway gently underfoot, like the deck of something unseen. Among those drawn to the legend was Dr. Albert Merrin, son of the late Silas Merrin of the Missouri Historical Society. Having inherited his father's notes, including the lost currents without river diagrams, Albert set out in 1936 to retrace the reports his father had compiled half a century earlier. He traveled with a single assistant, Henry Coates, a photographer from St. Louis. Their first impressions, recorded in Merrin's surviving field notebook, echoed earlier accounts. The basin appears still, though the grass grows in swirls rather than rows. When standing at the lowest point, one senses mild pressure in the ears, as if the atmosphere thickens here. Over several nights, they conducted sound measurements and barometric readings. On the second night, their instruments registered periodic fluctuations, brief drops in pressure accompanied by faint knocks, 3 at a time, evenly spaced. Merrin's commentary grew cautious. The cadence is deliberate. The amplitude does not suggest geological origin. It is as if something below is striking in response. Coates photographed the field under long exposure. One plate, developed weeks later, revealed streaks of reflected light cutting diagonally through the frame, thin and curved, like beams glancing off wet wood. During their third night, a low fog rolled in. Coates wrote in his own notebook, "Oak." The air seemed to move sideways, not down from the hills, but across the ground, as if following an invisible current. The temperature dropped suddenly. The doctor spoke softly, counting under his breath in rhythm with the sound. 11 seconds again. What happened afterward is unclear. Coates's final entry stops mid-sentence. Merrin's body was found days later by local hunters at the edge of the basin, seated upright against a tree, eyes open, compass clutched in his hand. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle. The compass needle spun freely, never settling. Coates was never found. When state authorities investigated, they noted the ground where Merrin had been found was damp, though there had been no rain for weeks. The official report concluded exhaustion and exposure. Unofficially, the sheriff told reporters he drowned on dry land. The story spread quietly across the Ozarks that summer, retold in taverns and campfires. For the first time in living memory, people began calling the basin by its old name again, the land harbor, the place where water once sailed the earth. By 1937, word of Dr. Albert Merrin's death reached the academic circles of St. Louis and Columbia, where it was received with a mix of embarrassment and fascination. Officially, his passing was attributed to exposure and exhaustion. But privately, colleagues whispered about the repeating pattern, how every generation of researchers seemed to vanish after reaching the same uncharted hollow in the Ozark Plateau. The Missouri Historical Society quietly boxed Merrin's papers, sealing them under private collection, restricted. Yet copies circulated informally. Among the recipients was Professor Daniel Reeve, an anthropologist studying Ozark folklore and geomythology. Reeve became convinced that the legend of the land harbor was not mere superstition, but a rare instance where folklore preserved a geological truth. Reeve's 1938 field report summarized the timeline succinctly. 1884. The stranded ship appears. 86. The Carter family vanishes. Calling disappears. 32. Halper lost during WPA survey. Bind 36. Marin found dead, compass spinning. He noted the rhythmic interval, 11 seconds, reoccurring across the testimonies and recordings, comparing it to seiches, the oscillations sometimes seen in enclosed lakes like Merrimack Springs underground pools. But his conclusions strayed from pure science. The rhythm seems less like tide and more like recall, the land rehearsing an old motion. When Reeve finally visited the basin in late autumn of 1938, he found it dry again. The grass was flattened in arcs, suggesting circular motion, and the soil emitted the faint scent of pine tar. He collected samples, noting streaks of mineral residue in the dirt, iron, magnesium, and traces of pitch, the same composition once found in the hull plank examined by Dr. Silas Marin years earlier. Locals warned him not to stay after dark. A farmer named Eli Turner, then in his C-20s, told him, "When the fog starts to rise, it ain't fog, it's memory coming up from where it shouldn't." Reeve ignored the warning and camped overnight. His notes from that evening survive thanks to a carbon copy mailed to his assistant 2 days earlier. They begin orderly, temperature, wind, air pressure, and then drift into something else. The ground shudders in rhythm. It's not wind or quake, but measured, every 11 seconds, a hollow tone. The earth below me feels hollow, like a drum waiting for a hand. He recorded one more paragraph before the page trails off into illegible smears. When a mail rider found the campsite days later, Reeve's tent was undisturbed, but his boots were found 10 feet from the basin, filled with clear water. The soil around them was bone dry. His assistant later said Reeve's last telegram, sent from Van Buren before departing, contained only 5 words. "The ship moves without sea." After that, the land harbor was declared off-limits to geological study. The county labeled it unstable landform and quietly discouraged travelers. But as locals said, such places don't vanish from memory. They wait. And every few decades, the ship was said to rise again, gliding just beneath the grass, its phantom prow cutting through Missouri dust. By 1939, the land harbor was no longer listed on any state geological map, yet travelers through the Ozark foothills still spoke of it in gas stations and rest stops, an unmarked basin near Van Buren, where the ground moved like water. The story grew distorted in each retelling. Some said the ship belonged to settlers who tried to sail the river westward. Others insisted it was a Civil War transport swallowed by an earthquake. But among older residents, the phrasing stayed precise: the ship that sails without water. That winter, a small group of journalists from the Kansas City Star decided to investigate. Their editor, curious about a series of frontier mysteries, approved the trip under the heading Lost Lands of Missouri. The team consisted of writer Margaret Ellison, photographer Paul Brandt, and guide Eli Turner, the same farmer who had warned Professor Reeve a year earlier. Ellison's article draft, never published but preserved in her family papers, reads with the same unnerving calm found in every serious report before it. The hollow lies still, yet the silence feels weighted, as if air itself had density. The grass bends in circular arcs, unbroken by hoof or foot. At dusk, the ground exhaled a vapor that caught the light, and for a moment it seemed the field turned to silver water. Turner refused to step closer, muttering prayers under his breath. Brandt, the photographer, advanced with his tripod. He took 3 exposures before the camera jammed. When he developed the negatives days later in Kansas City, the first two showed only landscape, hills, grass, the soft slope of the basin. The third was different. Across the lower half of the image stretched what looked like planking, curved and ribbed, faint as reflection. Brant swore the camera had not moved. Ellison believed him. Her follow-up note describes a subtle sound that accompanied the final shot, like a door shutting deep underground. That same night, fog rolled through their camp. Turner later claimed he heard the sound of waves, though no creek ran within miles. He said the earth rocked gentle, like a raft. When dawn came, their tent pegs had shifted, each angled slightly toward the basin. They left that morning, shaken but unharmed. Ellison's editor declined to print the story, calling it too folkloric for serious press. The negatives disappeared from the Star's archives soon after. Years later, Ellison wrote privately to a colleague, "I think what we saw was not apparition, but repetition, something rehearsing its return. The land seems to remember the weight of what once moved through it." By the outbreak of World War II, interest in the land harbor waned again. Roads improved, and the hollow slipped into forest. But the memory stayed close. Truckers passing the southern route at night claimed their headlights would sometimes shimmer as though crossing water. And always, the rhythm persisted. The faint pulse beneath the ground, 11 seconds apart. The same cadence that had haunted the Ozarks for more than 50 years. By 1941, war had consumed the world, and the Ozarks turned quiet again, its hills echoing only the hum of distant freight trains and wind moving through pine. Yet in Carter County, the old rhythm had not ceased. Residents near the abandoned hollow basin began reporting subtle tremors, enough to rattle panes, but never strong enough to register as quakes. The local paper, the Van Buren Chronicle, printed a small headline on May 3rd, "Ground stirs near Old Township. County engineer calls it air pockets." But the engineer, Frank Hollins, did not believe his own statement. His private notes, recovered later among his estate papers, tell a different story. Pressure fluctuations measurable on gauge, rhythmic, interval approximately 11 seconds. Feels as if air rising through solid stone, no fault line detected. Hollins visited the site 3 times that summer. On his final trip, he brought his teenage son, Calvin, who later gave an interview decades later describing what his father had seen. According to Calvin, the ground near the basin shimmered like heat, though the air was cool. He remembered his father crouching, listening to the soil with a stethoscope. After several seconds, Hollins stood abruptly, face pale, and said, "That's not pressure, it's movement." They left immediately. The next morning, when Hollins returned alone to collect his instruments, only his truck was found, engine still running, driver's door open, keys in ignition. The grass beside it was flattened in a smooth spiral that widened toward the basin. Sheriff reports from that week mention a mild sulfur odor hanging in the air and a faint sound like paddling, heard by witnesses up to a mile away. A search party scoured the area for 3 days before declaring Hollins lost, likely to ground subsidence. But Calvin never accepted that. In a 1970 interview, he recalled, "He told me, the L, last night he was home, that the land wasn't dead. It was breathing. Said he could hear something moving in the dark under us, slow as tidewater." The Chronicle printed one final note about the case a month later. Due to safety concerns, the Hollow Basin area will remain closed to the public until further notice. But no fence was ever built and no sign posted. Nature reclaimed the road within a season, leaving only the faint ridge where the Carter cabin had once stood. After that, the name Pine Hollow vanished entirely from county records. In its place appeared a simple notation on survey maps. Unstable terrain, no access. Still, a few who lived nearby said that when the wind was still and the night clear, they could hear it again. That distant, methodical rhythm, 11 seconds apart. Some said it sounded like a ship rocking gently on water. Others said it was the earth remembering what it once carried. By 1944, when most of Missouri's attention was turned to the war effort, the Hollow Basin had become almost entirely reclaimed by the forest. The county maintained no access road, and only a handful of logging crews ever ventured near it. Those who did returned with stories that fit the pattern too neatly to ignore. Strange drafts of cold air rising through cracks in the ground, soft rhythmic tremors, and a faint smell of resin drifting between the trees. One logger, Walter Nye, later wrote in his Union diary, "We felled 3 oaks near the basin edge. Every time the saw bit deep, the ground seemed to answer back. 3 knocks, even pace, as if from below. We stopped when the dirt began to move under the stump like water." That same year, a wartime training unit from Fort Leonard Wood used part of Carter County for navigation drills. On August 17, 1944, a small detachment of cadets was sent to map elevations in the Ozark foothills. When they returned to camp, one of their instructors, Lieutenant Everett Price, filed an unusual observation. Unmarked depression at grid 14D displays subsidence inconsistent with soil type. Air vibrations recorded via compass deflection, repeating in timed sequence. Men reported sensation of rolling motion under boots, though ground remained still. Price's superiors dismissed the report as an instrumentation error, yet within a month, military surveyors quietly erased grid 14D from their maps. The official explanation cited terrain inconsistency. Around this time, a local historian, Clara Vann, stumbled across Reverend Worth's 1888 diary, the one written after the first ship vanished. Reading through its brittle pages, she noticed a line that mirrored the lieutenant's phrasing. "The ground is steady, but I feel it roll beneath me, as if I stand on something afloat." Vann began compiling a timeline of all recorded incidents from 1884 to 1944, aligning them with geological surveys and flood data. The intervals, 40 to 50 years apart, suggested a pattern, a slow rhythm of resurfacing. In her typewritten notes, she wrote, "If these appearances follow a cycle, the Hollow Basin might not be a sinkhole, but an aperture, a breathing wound in the land." She sent her findings to the Missouri Geological Society, receiving no reply. Her friends recalled that she grew withdrawn after mailing that report, convinced she had woken something that preferred silence. In November 1944, neighbors reported seeing lights moving through the trees near her home, soft, flickering, and rhythmic. When they visited the next morning, her car was gone, her typewriter still warm, a single page left in the roller. It's not the ship that moves, it's the ground that sails. No one ever located her vehicle. Weeks later, a hunter found a scrap of her notebook miles away near the overgrown basin. The last legible line read simply, 11 seconds, steady again. By 1948, the forest had sealed nearly every trace of the Hollow Basin. Locals said the land closed its mouth, swallowing the clearing whole. Roads stopped at walls of cedar and tangled oak, and no maps mentioned the area by name. Yet the story endured, quietly, in kitchens and schoolyards, a tale of something below that moved like water and remembered what it once carried. That autumn, a young reporter from the St. Louis Dispatch, Harold Wexler, was assigned to write a human interest feature on vanishing towns of the Ozarks. He stumbled across a footnote in the county records referring to unclaimed property, Section 12, Pine Hollow, former. It mentioned ground instability and prior government restriction. The phrasing intrigued him. Wexler spent 2 weeks interviewing locals. Most refused to talk. One elderly woman, perhaps the last living witness of the pre-war years, told him simply, "It's not cursed, son. It's tired. The land gets tired of holding secrets." He finally reached Calvin Hollins, son of the missing county engineer. The man was living alone outside Van Buren, gray-haired and cautious. In Wexler's transcript, Calvin said, "You don't find the place, it finds you. Starts with the ground humming just under your boots. When that happens, you walk the other way." Despite warnings, Wexler located the basin's approximate coordinates and set out with a field photographer, Miriam Lyle. They found the terrain thick with reeds and young pines, the air oddly warm though the season had turned. His report, later discovered in an envelope marked "Not for Print," described what they saw. A hollow clearing, roughly circular, with vegetation flattened outward. No sound from insects or birds. Air pressure fluctuates every few moments. Ears pop as though descending underwater. At dusk, they set up a tripod. Wexler wrote that the ground beneath their feet shifted without breaking, a motion too slow to notice until it stopped. Then came the sound, a low, hollow tone, followed by 3 distinct knocks, steady and far below. Lyle's camera shutter jammed after one photograph. The plate was overexposed, but faint outlines were visible, arcs of wood, curved shadows, and something that looked like a mast lost in fog. They packed and left before midnight. 2 days later, the dispatch received a telegram from Wexler sent from Poplar Bluff. "Filed story. Do not publish until I confirm. There's movement under the land every 11 seconds. He was never heard from again. The story never ran. Months later, the unopened film canister from Lyle's camera was found in the paper's storeroom, mislabeled. When developed decades later, archivists noted a faint reflection along the frame's horizon, light rippling across what appeared to be still earth, as if caught mid-wave. After that, the file on Pine Hollow closed for good. The county sealed the area in 1950, calling it Geologic Hazard Zone 3A, but those who lived nearby said the air still pulsed on quiet nights, like breath through a sleeping giant. Today, the name Pine Hollow exists only in forgotten survey notes and in the whispers of those who live near the farthest reaches of the Ozark Mountains. The forest has reclaimed everything: the road, the cabins, the basin itself. From above, the land appears smooth, unremarkable. But locals say that when fog settles low and the wind stills, you can feel the ground exhale. A slow pulse beneath your boots, timed like a heartbeat, 11 seconds apart. The last official visit to the site occurred in 1951, when state surveyors confirmed the depression had filled with water once again. It was shallow, but impossibly clear. Beneath the glassy surface, they reported the faint outline of ribs curving through the silt, forming a pattern too symmetrical to be natural. Their report ended abruptly. No further analysis recommended. The hollow basin vanished from all maps after that year. By the 1960s, even the coordinates were forgotten. Yet stories continued. Hunters glimpsing light flickering beneath fog, hikers hearing soft knocking underfoot, truckers claiming the earth shimmered like water as they passed the southern ridge. None stayed long enough to prove it. Historians looking back on the case found that every investigator, from Dr. Whitlock's first field notes in 1884 to Professor Keating's recordings in the 1920s to Albert Marin's final breath in 1936, had recorded the same pulse, the same rhythm, always 11 seconds apart. A few geologists have since proposed theories: underground rivers shifting pressure, the collapse of a hidden aquifer, or even residual seismic harmonics. But none explain the strange consistency, nor why fragments of timber continue to surface after every major drought. Wood that smells of pitch and salt in a place that's never known the sea. The last known mention came from a forestry ranger in 1963 who wrote in his patrol log, "Clearing by the old ridge, ground feels hollow again, air moving up from below, cold as deep water. Heard knocking once, then silence. I didn't stay." He never returned to that section of the forest, and so the record ends much as it began, with a vessel that appeared where no water ran, in a land that seems to remember tides long gone. Whether the ship was ever real, or the land itself merely dreaming of motion, no one can say. But the rhythm remains, buried deep beneath the Ozark soil, patient, measured, and waiting. Even now, some nights, when the fog settles heavy across the valley and the earth goes still, those who listen claim they can hear it again. That slow, distant sound, steady as an oar striking a hollow hull, moving nowhere at all,